And we're live. We're here with David Meyer, Senior Manager at Comsearch, Board Member of NSMA, past President of NSMA. And David's been helming our Working Group 3, which is a lot of our deep dives, a lot of our core work on guidelines that we give to the FCC and the rest of the world. Welcome aboard, David. I know, and just folks on the back end, we around 4 p.m. we'll be doing an NSMA board meeting for those of us on the NSMA board. We'll do that through Zoom. But take it away, David, and folks know to go into the chat with any questions. And again, welcome aboard, David.
All right, thank you, Joe. I want to check first. Can you all hear a drum background?
Very
If
faint.
not, we're okay. Okay.
Extremely faint.
Yeah. Good. Okay, my grandson is down in the basement, but he happens to be playing the drums at the moment, so timing is everything. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about Working Group 3, and depending how quickly we go through this, Joe, we may be to the board meeting well before 4 o'clock. So
yeah, no worries. No worries. Whatever.
Okay. So if we look at Working Group 3, NSMA has, I think it was in excess of 20 working groups over the years since we initially started in 1984. And they kind of come and go as far as being active depending on circumstances or what is needed by NSMA to support either changes in spectrum policy or changes in the rules, et cetera, et cetera. So Working Group 3 right now is pretty much the only active working group, and it is essentially, I'll go through the purpose of the working group. I'll talk briefly about who participates and who the stakeholders are. We'll look at the meeting schedule that we usually have. We're going to take a long look at the last 24 months. Since we did not have a conference last year, that period is extended longer than a year. And then we'll look at the focus for the next 12 months. So that's kind of what we're going to plan on going through here. All right. So what is the purpose of Working Group 3? Working Group 3 is set up to provide a forum for spectrum discussions. It's to help develop industry consensus on spectrum issues. It's to help develop specific coordination procedures. If most everybody's probably familiar with the Part 101 coordination rules. And if you read through them, they're a fairly concise set of directions which do not cover a vast majority or a vast number of circumstances that we as frequency coordinators run into. So one of the things that NSMA does is help set up those requirements or fill in the recommendations. So we create and maintain recommendations for industry guidance. We help interpret FCC rules for the licensee and the coordinators out there. We provide feedback and content for NSMA regulatory filings. And we also are set up to refer issues to the NSMA board for either further action or activation in one of the existing but currently inactive working groups. So it's kind of a broad purpose that we're going through there. So if you look at all of those steps, one of the questions that may come up is, well, what kind of coordination process do we go through? And a very simplified, 3-step process. You notify all the potentially affected parties in the shared bands. Parties generally have 30 days. According to the rules, the vast majority of coordinations are responded to within a few days, within a week. And many of them request a 2-week response. So that 30 days is kind of the outside target. And the third step is to resolve any interference concerns. So it sounds very simple on its face. If you look at who's involved, that's also fairly simple. This is the picture of the terrestrial coordination zone. The terrestrial path noted in orange kind of is the path that's being coordinated. And essentially any path that has a receiver or transmitter inside the circle based on the distance in the band, you need to send a notice to. You combine this with the Earth station coordination areas, which can be 200, 300, some of them even 400 kilometers long or wide. Then it can encompass a lot of licensees, but it's a fairly straightforward process. But you're saying, why do we need all this? So if we look at Los Angeles, and this is just an extraction looking at the 6, 11, 18, and 23 gigahertz paths in the LA area. And if you were to put a pinpoint in the middle of Los Angeles and draw a 150 kilometer circle, you would come up with almost 12,000 microwave paths in these bands. So, and those paths have all been, these are the point-to-point licensed microwave paths. So they have all been coordinated, gone through the prior coordination process, and gone, some, depending on the stage, would either have been filed for. So if you look, I wanted to focus in on one area. If you look on the bottom right of that group, you'll see a pretty good wheel pattern. And what I did was, there's a site there called Black Mountain, California. This is essentially what that looks like from a path basis, all coming out of anything at that set of coordinates. I think I did a plus or minus half a kilometer circle. It's somewhere close to 100 paths, point-to-point licensed microwave paths coming out of that one site. And if you look in other areas of the country, this is Jump Off Joe Butte, or Joe Butte, depending on the site name. And again, it's a very busy, because of geography, it's a very busy point, area, if you will. I think in this area there were over 85 microwave paths. And all of them, again, were coordinated through the coordination process. And then I wanted to take one last look just for fun. This is New York City, 11 gigahertz paths only, which if you draw a 100 kilometer circle around New York City, you get, I think it's close to 1,700 11 gigahertz microwave paths. So it's a very busy, but it's in a very active area. But right now we have everything in place for people to coordinate new paths, to activate new channels, to make changes to existing ones. And it's primarily because of the additional recommendations NSMA has put in place, driven through Working Group 3. So who are the participants and the stakeholders? So again, we have an open forum that's available to all NSMA members, and we even have associated people with the industry that chime in. They may not be able to vote on recommendations, but they still provide feedback. If you want to start to take a look at what's impacting the spectrum industry, Working Group 3 meetings are a great place to start. We approach it from the standpoint of, let's look and see if it's a coordination issue, something that we can handle, or again, if we need to refer it to the NSMA board and talk to them about setting up and activating an additional working group. Current active members include coordinators, spectrum managers, manufacturers, service providers, vendors, broadcasters, consultants, licensees, and a good number of even retirees that, it's like those old engineers, they never can let go, the radio. So we appreciate their contribution and everything that they provide. You got a few laughs there. So if you look on at our meetings, we typically meet once a month. It's usually the third, occasionally the fourth Tuesday of the month. The next meeting is scheduled for May 25th. We actually meet at noon Eastern time, and generally at a maximum time, the meeting runs an hour and a half. And typically in those meetings, we're going to try to cover, anywhere from, 3 to 4 specific recommendations or topics, and, try to move things through with consensus on agreement on what we want to put forward. I do provide monthly meeting agendas, for the meeting focus and whatever documents are under review. We also try to assign individual editors to each recommendation that we come up with that's either being created or that needs to be adjusted or updated. And we also have an open discussion time of any new or pertinent spectrum issues. The other thing is I also have a subcommittee of this group that specifically talks to a smaller group of broadcast and auxiliary service or TV spectrum users, and that is generally at 1:30 immediately after the primary meeting. So that's pretty much where we meet. We in the past, and we'll probably continue to use WebEx, so we're able to present, pretty much communicate at will. So they work out pretty well. So I'm going to focus now on the results of the past 24 months. And again, I'm not going to read every descriptive term here. This is more to give you kind of a history on what the group has talked about and done in the last 2 years. So we'll start at the top. I did include dates on here, approximately when the group concluded the activity or passed them onto the board. So in July of 2019, we had a review done and agreement that the recommendation regarding coordinating in the BAS and cable TV bands was still current. It had been put together and published in 2017, so that was good news. There's a group of recommendations. There are 5 of them from the late 80s and late 90s that all have to do with terrain loss, over the horizon propagation loss. And we had we'll put this in quotes, we had an eager volunteer in Tom Willis who agreed to undertake the effort of reviewing those for potentially updating. So that is a process he is still going through. And if any of you have any expertise or interest in terrain loss, over the horizon propagation loss, and you'd like to join Tom in this effort, I'm sure he would appreciate any help. We also discussed in September 2019 coordination contours for terrestrial microwave systems, which kind of gleaned back to that hourglass, circle and extension frame that we looked at earlier. In November of 2019, we talked about the contents of PCNs for fixed microwave services. With all the different changes in the modulation schemes, adaptive modulation, and everything involved, we really had to reach back and redraft and redo that original documentation. We had quite a big lag time here. Part of that was driven by cancellation of several months meetings while we were all trying to figure out what was going on with COVID. But we also are going through the process of looking at all the recommendations and eliminating those that are no longer needed. So this one, the second recommendation on this list, auto renewal growth channels linked with licensed links. The committee determined that that was an obsolete recommendation and should be archived. The next one had to do with precipitation scatter beam intersections, which after extensive research in the rules, we've found that since 1986, essentially had disappeared. So that was also deemed as obsolete to be moved and archived. We had a new recommendation on radiation pattern envelope, on how to develop kind of the minimum standards type of thing, because we found that we did not have that type of document and that there was a need with some of the new antennas and new manufacturers that had come onto the scene. So that recommendation came out as our first one in 2020, in October of 2020. The last recommendation on this page, 89.018, were the defined parties of coordination, and we determined this was obsolete. It had been replaced by a further recommendation from 2014. Moving on into 2020, We had a new recommendation, 2020.002, that had to do with how do you protect prior coordination data on a path when it's going through FCC filing. And the reason that came up is because a licensee filed for a coordinated path, but due to some activity at the commission, wound up getting the applications returned, waited a few months, and then refiled. And several of the or some of the coordinators had pulled that data out of the database. So we were trying to fill a hole that had been created by a real life issue with a licensee. Working group recommendation 2020.003 was a replacement of a previous coordination or a previous recommendation from the early 90s, content of direct interference case reports. Again, this was driven largely by the changes in technology and the information that we have on the new, everything from adaptive modulation to using, declaring an ACM advantage. So we needed to come up with better, improved data points on what needed to be provided. Coordination recommendation 2020.004 replaced, it was an updated version of a recommendation from 1986 and had to do with coordination follow-up advisories. Recommendation 89.021 was one where it went into details on requiring terrain loss, which is a standard in the industry on case analysis, so that was deemed as obsolete. The last recommendation, everybody I'm sure will get a laugh of, was from 89 and had to do with providing paper copies of verbal coordination requests. So by way of email, we've decided that that is an obsolete recommendation. Okay, and then finally, in April of 2021, there was a recommendation 2021.005 that replaced a much earlier recommendation from 1989, had to do with the inclusion of case resolution information in PCNs and how coordinators and licensees would deal with that. So that, in a rapid, shotgun approach, kind of lets you know what we worked on and what we met about and talked about in the last 2 years as far as the recommendations. So what's under current discussion and what we're going to talk about on May 25th is 3 recommendations from 1990 and 1 recommendation from 1989. The first one, notification of apparent operational discrepancies. I believe the group has pretty much decided this is still valid, even though it's probably rarely fully followed. This recommendation essentially says that if you're working on a project and you identify a licensee as incorrect coordinates, and even other information is possible, but primarily coordinates, that you should at least notify that party, even if they're the one you're not working for. So again, it's simply a recommendation to try and keep the data that's out there that the industry uses as most accurate as possible. We're going to be talking about the request for expedited responses, which I believe we're going to find out was actually updated by a subsequent recommendation. There's one on added information for C-band transmit earth stations. And again, I believe the point of the discussion at the moment is I think that's probably one that's going to stay. And then finally, we've been having an ongoing discussion about station names, the size and the breadth, and that actually led into a much larger discussion on ULS data fields. And we are hopefully in the final steps of creating an ex parte letter to the FCC, which is going to talk about several fields that NSMA feels it would be beneficial to expand to a much larger size than they currently are. So our focus for the next 12 months. We are going to continually reviewing every existing NSMA recommendation, and I think there's approximately 28 to 30 left. So hopefully within doing 2 to 4 a month we don't get bogged down in one, we will have that hopefully pretty much done by the time we roll around next year. But again, we could easily be sidetracked if we get tied up, digging into one of these, and it really could divert us for a while. But we're also going to be adding new recommendations as needed. Again, this is driven by either NSMA member requests or what is happening on the Spectrum front at the FCC. And we're going to provide Spectrum news and a forum for discussion and try our best to resolve stakeholder Spectrum issues through industry study and consensus building. So that is going to be our focus for the next 12 months. So if you would like to join us, certainly send me an email, dmeyer@comsearch.com, and I will be glad to add you to the distribution list. And then I want to open this. I don't know if you've got any questions, certainly holler out. It's more of simply a report on the working group and what we're involved in, but I'll certainly take any questions or if anybody has any feedback.
Thank you, David. That was very well detailed, and it's nice to see an overview like that. It's a lot of the core work of what we do at NSMA, and I think everyone appreciates that on a lot of levels. One comment we got is, can we hear your grandson play? So maybe we'll have to get a CD of that later. On I know we were talking about this a while back about the actual cells in terms of the amount of space we can put into the system when we're trying to file. What are your thoughts on where that's going or has gone?
Well, I think I'm going by memory because I don't have that particular historical email in front of me. But I believe we decided on was it a 60 character variable character field length, primarily focused on location names, site names, model numbers, radio model numbers, antenna model numbers, manufacturer's names, so that it would not be so many options, why would somebody logically use more than 60 characters for a site name when it would make it very, very difficult to use that in any type of, correspondence or, identifying document short of a database. So I do think that the field length we decided on was good. As I said, I think if we can just finish up the text of the letter and get that over, I think it will be, a good step in a lot of areas, especially as, the point you had brought up over the months of discussion was, when you're talking about macro and micro cells for some of these, links, then hopefully, 60 characters is going to go a lot longer than the current. I think 20 is the current limit. So it should give people a lot more flexibility to identify sites and video and antennas.
That's great. Yeah, and I'm not aware of like a town being called like supercalifragilisticexpialidocious. So unless we hit one of those, I think we should be good. So did you another thing that came up, and I don't know if you had time to reflect more on it. Thomas Kidd mentioned yesterday that they're thinking about this idea of AI in spectrum coordination, and I don't know, I guess collectively, do we think that's an idea to explore? And if we did, would that be something that would probably would require some sort of at least consideration, whether or not there should be a guideline around that, right?
Yeah, no, I'm sure it would. I mean, if you look at where some of the spectrum movement has gone with the automatic frequency selection, component of the 3.5 gigahertz band, and I think there's probably a place for it. But if you look at the industry, I mean, there is just a handful of coordinators that coordinate more than just a few paths a year. And they're all independent companies, And a lot of times it's getting to the point with these point-to-point microwave paths where you've got to have an engineer review what's going on, because you get into these complicated, not only growth channels, but, you're talking about, a radio with 8 adaptive modulations, and evaluating, well, can you use ATPC on which channels, how does that impact the environment? And then analyzing everything that goes into it. I mean, I think there is some, artificial intelligence work that might, benefit that. But again, you're talking about, if you're looking at moving the prior coordination process back to the FCC, I think that would be the direction that would take, because if it was automatic, you had an artificial intelligence, then the government could, build it and, cut our industry down, so to speak. But I think there's also a lot of non-technical questions that come in, when you want to talk to somebody about upgrading their antenna so that you can squeeze in another path on a heavily populated tower, or, you want to talk about eating into 7 or 8 dB of their fade margin, or looking at a grow channel that they essentially coordinated 3 months ago. Those take personal judgment, obviously, on the person putting it in, but it also requires a give and take with the industry. I mean, that's the whole point of the prior coordination process. It's not simply notification; it's coordination, discussion, and resolution of issues.
Yeah.
And I think that's an important segment when we're dealing with as congested as it's gotten in a lot of bands.
Yeah. Fair enough. Yeah. So appreciate the reflections on that. And of course, the ongoing work and the fact that we had basically a 2-year hiatus between our reports. So that's much appreciated. And I know this will get uploaded for folks who want to review it on their own time as well. I know it's 3:50. I know we have a 4 p.m. board meeting. People might want to break. Unless there's any questions I haven't seen, I think that covers the waterfront. But want to thank you again, David, for this detailed review. People are popping emojis. Good work. Well, yeah,
Thank you.
much appreciated. So without further ado, then we'll close out the NSMA 2021 online. Appreciate the audience. We had really good audience registration and participation, and blue chip presenters from almost every aspect of the industry we could think of: government, industry, regulatory, terrestrial, fixed, mobile, satellite, on and on and on. So, and all the other, issues on the edge. So, appreciate everyone's participation for sure. And we're looking forward to more spectrum managers being created, and continuing to lead as wireless becomes more and more of an infrastructure element that people cannot do without. So we're in the center of it, and we're riding the wave. So the board meeting, everyone on the board should have gotten an email yesterday for the Zoom link for that, and that'll be 4:00 Eastern in about 9 minutes. Otherwise, thank you so much. Don't forget to use your free breakfast cards. People got free online breakfast from Starbucks for registering. So drink that coffee, eat those sandwiches. Take care.